Tonight, as we settle into the gentle embrace of evening, we embark on a remarkable journey through history. We'll discover how one man, who never traveled more than 200 miles from his birthplace, never wrote a single book, never commanded an army, and never held political office, managed to transform the world in ways that still echo through our daily lives. From the hospitals where we seek healing to the universities where we pursue knowledge, from the very concept of human rights to the art that adorns our walls, the fingerprints of Jesus Christ can be found everywhere. This is not merely a story of religious belief, but a documented exploration of historical fact, a gentle examination of how a teacher from ancient Palestine became the most influential figure in human history. So let your mind drift as we trace the extraordinary ripple effects of a life that changed everything. This is the bedtime history of how Jesus Christ changed the world forever. Chapter 1. The humble beginning of an extraordinary revolution. Picture, if you will, the ancient world into which Jesus was born. The year was approximately 4 BC, and the Mediterranean basin was dominated by the iron fist of Rome. It was a civilization built on conquest, slavery, and the rigid stratification of human worth. In this world, might made right, and the strong devoured the weak without a second thought. Women were considered property, often abandoned as infants if they were deemed unwanted. Children had no rights and could be sold into slavery at their parents' whim. The elderly and infirm were left to die when they became burdens. Gladiatorial contests filled massive arenas where thousands gathered to watch human beings tear each other apart for entertainment. Sexual promiscuity and moral decay had reached staggering proportions, while the gap between rich and poor stretched like an unbridgeable chasm. Into this harsh landscape walked a man unlike any the world had ever seen. Born in the small town of Bethlehem, raised in the humble village of Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth emerged from the most unlikely of circumstances. His earthly father was a carpenter, his mother a young woman of no particular social standing. By every measure of worldly success, he should have lived and died in complete obscurity. Yet from his earliest teachings, something revolutionary began to stir. When Jesus spoke of love for enemies, of turning the other cheek, of caring for the least and the lost, he wasn't merely offering religious platitudes, he was articulating a completely new vision of what it meant to be human. A vision that would ultimately topple the foundations of the ancient world and rebuild civilization on entirely different principles. His public ministry lasted only 3 short years. Compare that to the great philosophers of antiquity. Socrates taught for 40 years, Plato for 50, Aristotle for 40. Yet the influence of Christ's 3-year ministry would infinitely transcend the combined impact of these intellectual giants. How could this be possible? How? The answer lies not in the length of his teaching, but in the radical nature of his message and the transformative power it unleashed in human hearts. Jesus didn't simply offer new ideas about God or morality. He demonstrated a completely different way of living, one that elevated the dignity of every human being and proclaimed that even the humblest person possessed infinite worth. Chapter 2. The dawn of a new era. When Jesus walked the dusty roads of Palestine, he encountered a world where human life was cheap and suffering was accepted as the natural order of things. The sick were often viewed as cursed by the gods. The poor were dismissed as lazy or worthless. Women were treated as second-class citizens at best. Yet everywhere Jesus went, he challenged these assumptions with both his words and his actions. He touched lepers whom society had cast out as untouchable. He spoke with women as equals, shocking his contemporaries who believed women shouldn't even be taught religious matters. He welcomed children when his own disciples tried to turn them away. He ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, the despised outcasts of respectable society. In doing so, he wasn't just being kind or compassionate, he was making a revolutionary statement about the fundamental worth of every human being. This message began to spread like wildfire through the ancient world, carried by ordinary people who had encountered something extraordinary. Within decades of Jesus' death, communities of believers had sprouted across the Roman Empire. These early Christians lived radically different lives from their pagan neighbors. They cared for the sick during plagues when others fled in terror. They rescued abandoned babies, particularly girls whom Roman society routinely left to die. They shared their possessions with the poor and treated slaves as brothers and sisters. The transformation was so dramatic that it caught the attention of the Roman authorities. Here was a movement that seemed to turn the established order upside down. Slaves were declaring themselves equal to their masters in the sight of God. Women were taking active roles in religious communities. The poor were being treated with dignity and respect. This wasn't just a new religion. It was a social revolution that threatened to remake civilization itself. By the year 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, legalizing Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. What had begun as a small sect of Jewish believers had grown into a force powerful enough to transform the mightiest empire on earth. By 380 AD, Christianity had become the official religion of Rome. The same empire that had crucified Jesus now bowed before his teachings. But this was only the beginning. As Christianity spread beyond the borders of the Roman world, it carried with it a set of values and principles that would gradually reshape every aspect of human civilization. The seeds planted by a carpenter's son in ancient Palestine were about to blossom into institutions and innovations that would benefit all of humanity. Chapter 3. The birth of modern healthcare. One of the most tangible ways Jesus changed the world can be seen in the development of modern healthcare. Before Christianity, medical care was largely reserved for the wealthy elite. The poor suffered and died without access to healing, while the sick were often viewed as deserving their fate due to moral failings or divine displeasure. Jesus changed all of this with his revolutionary approach to healing and caring for the afflicted. Throughout his ministry, he consistently reached out to the sick, the disabled, and the suffering. More importantly, he commanded his followers to do the same. Heal the sick, he told them. Care for the least of these. This wasn't merely a suggestion. It became a fundamental obligation for those who claimed to follow his teachings. The early Christians took these words to heart in remarkable ways. When devastating plagues swept through the Roman Empire, something extraordinary happened. While pagans fled the cities to save themselves, Christians remained behind to care for the sick and dying. They didn't just tend to fellow believers. They cared for anyone who needed help, regardless of their faith or social status. This Christian response to suffering had profound consequences. During the Great Plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities actually grew larger, while pagan populations declined. The reason was simple. Basic nursing care, providing water and food to the sick, significantly improved survival rates. By staying to help when others fled, Christians not only saved lives, but demonstrated the power of their faith in action. As Christianity spread and gained influence, this commitment to healing became institutionalized. Christian communities began establishing the world's first hospitals. These weren't just places where the wealthy could receive private medical attention. They were charitable institutions dedicated to caring for anyone who needed help, particularly the poor who had nowhere else to turn. The oldest hospitals in Europe and America tell this story beautifully. Institution after institution was founded by devout Christians who were motivated by their sincere belief that caring for the sick was a sacred duty. Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in 1751 by Quaker Christian Dr. Thomas Bond, remains one of the nation's leading medical centers today. New York Presbyterian Hospital, established in 1771 by Episcopal Christian Samuel Bard, continues to rank among America's top healthcare institutions. Massachusetts General Hospital, founded in 1811 by Reverend John Bartlett, maintains its position as one of the premier medical facilities in the world. These hospitals didn't emerge from secular philanthropy or government initiative. They were born from the Christian conviction that every human being, regardless of wealth or status, deserved access to healing and care. The poor, who once suffered without medical attention, now had places to turn for help. The model these Christian institutions established gradually spread around the world, transforming healthcare from a privilege of the wealthy into a basic human right. Today, the Catholic Church alone operates the largest non-government healthcare system on earth. With around 18,000 clinics, 16,000 homes for the elderly and those with special needs, and 5,500 hospitals worldwide, the Church manages approximately 26% of the world's healthcare facilities. 65% of these hospitals are located in developing countries, serving the world's most vulnerable populations. This vast network of healing didn't appear by accident. It grew directly from the example and teachings of Jesus Christ, who showed his followers that caring for the sick wasn't just an act of kindness, but a sacred responsibility. The modern hospital, with all its life-saving technology and compassionate care, traces its roots back to a carpenter from Nazareth who touched lepers and healed the broken. Chapter 4. The foundation of higher learning. If you've ever walked across a university campus, attended a college lecture, or earned a degree, you've participated in an institution that owes its very existence to the influence of Jesus Christ. The modern university system, with its commitment to learning, research, and the pursuit of knowledge, emerged directly from the Christian worldview that Jesus introduced to the world. Before Christianity, formal education was largely reserved for the elite classes of society. Knowledge was hoarded by the powerful as a tool of control rather than shared as a gift to humanity. The idea that all people, regardless of their social status, deserved access to education was virtually unknown in the ancient world. Jesus changed this paradigm in profound ways. His own ministry was fundamentally educational. He was called rabbi, meaning teacher, and everywhere he went he taught people about truth, justice, and the nature of reality. More importantly, he taught that every human being was created in the image of God and therefore possessed inherent dignity and worth. This revolutionary concept laid the groundwork for the democratization of knowledge that would follow. As Christianity spread throughout Europe, Christian leaders began establishing schools and centers of learning. The cathedral schools of the early Middle Ages became the seedbeds from which the first universities would eventually grow. These weren't just institutions for training clergy, they became centers of advanced education, where students could study theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. The University of Oxford, one of the world's oldest and most prestigious institutions of higher learning, emerged directly from these Christian educational traditions. Founded in the 12th century, Oxford began as a collection of Christian scholars devoted to the pursuit of truth and knowledge. The university's motto, "The Lord is my light," reflects its deeply Christian foundations. Similarly, Cambridge University arose from Christian intellectual traditions and required its professors to be ordained Anglican priests well into the modern era. Even Isaac Newton, one of history's greatest scientists, had to receive a special exemption from the king to accept his position at Cambridge without taking holy orders, since his non-Trinitarian beliefs technically made him a heretic under Anglican doctrine. Across the Atlantic, the same pattern repeated itself. Harvard University, founded in 1636, was established by Christians specifically to train clergy and ensure that future generations would have educated religious leaders. Yale, Princeton, and countless other American institutions of higher learning emerged from similar Christian motivations. The irony is profound. Today, society often portrays Christians as anti-intellectual or opposed to learning. Yet the historical record shows clearly that Christians have done more to promote education and the pursuit of knowledge than any other group in human history. The very institutions where secular intellectuals today sometimes mock Christian beliefs were founded by devout believers who saw education as a sacred calling. This Christian commitment to learning wasn't limited to religious subjects. Medieval Christian universities became centers of scientific inquiry and philosophical investigation. Scholars like Robert Grosseteste, Albert the Great, Roger Bacon, and Thomas Aquinas helped establish the scientific method and laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would follow. The Christian worldview provided the perfect foundation for serious academic inquiry. If human beings were created in the image of a rational God, then the universe itself must be rational and comprehensible. If God had given humans minds capable of understanding his creation, then the pursuit of knowledge was not just permissible, but obligatory. This theological framework unleashed an explosion of learning and discovery that continues to benefit humanity today. Chapter 5. The Scientific Revolution's Christian Roots. Perhaps nowhere is the transformative influence of Jesus Christ more surprising to modern observers than in the development of science itself. Many people today assume that science and Christianity are natural enemies, locked in an eternal battle between reason and faith. The historical reality tells a completely different story. The scientific revolution, that remarkable period from roughly 1300 to 1700, when modern science emerged, took place in an explicitly Christian context. The very foundations of scientific thinking were laid by devout believers, who saw their research as a form of worship, a way of understanding the mind of God through studying his creation. The Christian worldview provided several crucial elements that made scientific inquiry possible. First was the concept of intelligibility. If the universe was created by a rational God, then nature itself must be rational and comprehensible. This wasn't true in other religious systems where gods were often capricious and unpredictable, making the natural world chaotic and unknowable. Second was the belief in human rationality. Since humans were created in God's image, they possessed minds capable of understanding the rational order built into creation. This gave early scientists confidence that their investigations could actually yield reliable knowledge about the natural world. Third was the conviction that studying nature was a noble and worthwhile pursuit. Rather than being a distraction from spiritual concerns, understanding creation was seen as a way of glorifying the Creator. This religious motivation drove countless scientists to dedicate their lives to research and discovery. The evidence for Christianity's role in founding modern science is overwhelming. Between 1901 and 2001, approximately 56.5% of Nobel Prize laureates in scientific fields were Christians. Many of the greatest scientific pioneers were devout believers whose faith motivated their research. Nicolaus Copernicus, who revolutionized astronomy by proposing that the Earth orbits the Sun, was a Catholic canon who saw his work as revealing the elegant design of God's creation. René Descartes, the father of analytical geometry and co-founder of modern philosophy, was a devout Catholic whose mathematical insights emerged from his theological convictions. Gregor Mendel, the Austrian monk who discovered the laws of genetic inheritance, conducted his groundbreaking experiments in his monastery garden. His understanding of heredity laid the foundation for all modern genetics and biotechnology. Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian priest who proposed the Big Bang theory of cosmic origins, saw his cosmological research as exploring the moment of divine creation itself. As historian Lawrence Principe notes, the Catholic Church has been probably the largest single and longest-term patron of science in history. Far from opposing scientific inquiry, Christian institutions actively promoted and funded research for centuries. The universities they established became the centers where modern science developed. Even more remarkable is the geographic specificity of science's emergence. Advanced civilizations had existed in China, India, the Islamic world, and elsewhere for thousands of years. Yet, as scholars Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton observe, the type of thinking known today as scientific, with its emphasis upon experiment and mathematical formulation, arose in one culture, Western Europe, and in no other. What made Western Europe unique? Its Christian foundation. As paleontologist Lauren Isley noted, It was the Christian world which finally gave birth in a clear, articulate fashion to the experimental method of science itself. The belief that a rational creator had designed a comprehensible universe, combined with the conviction that humans were called to understand that creation, provided the perfect launching pad for scientific investigation. This doesn't mean that science couldn't have developed in other contexts, or that all Christians have always supported scientific inquiry. But it does mean that the historical emergence of modern science was profoundly shaped by Christian beliefs and Christian institutions. Chapter 6. The Renaissance of Art and Beauty. As evening settles around us and we continue our gentle journey through history, we turn our attention to one of the most beautiful ways Jesus Christ transformed our world, through the magnificent realm of art and creative expression. When we walk through the world's greatest museums today, when we stand before towering cathedrals that seem to touch the heavens themselves, when we listen to soaring musical compositions that stir our souls, we are witnessing the profound artistic revolution that flowed from the life and teachings of a humble carpenter. Jesus himself painted no pictures, carved no statues, composed no symphonies. Yet his influence on human creativity has been more profound than any artist who ever lived. The greatest masterpieces of Western civilization, from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel to Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, from Bach's sacred cantatas to Handel's Messiah, all spring from the wellspring of inspiration that Jesus provided to countless artists across the centuries. In the ancient world, art primarily served two purposes. It glorified the powerful, and it celebrated the gods of pagan mythology. Sculptures depicted emperors and warriors. Paintings adorned the walls of wealthy villas with scenes of conquest and indulgence. Beauty was reserved for the elite, while common people lived surrounded by ugliness and squalor. Christianity changed this forever. The early church understood that if every human being was created in God's image, then beauty and artistic expression should be available to all people, not just the wealthy few. Churches became galleries where even the poorest peasant could encounter magnificent art. Stained glass windows told stories in brilliant color for those who couldn't read. Intricate stone carvings transformed humble buildings into works of wonder. During the medieval period, when much of Europe struggled with poverty and political chaos, the church became the primary patron of artistic creation. Monasteries preserved ancient knowledge while commissioning new works of beauty. Cathedral builders developed revolutionary architectural techniques that allowed them to create structures of unprecedented height and elegance. The Gothic cathedrals that still inspire awe today were born from the Christian conviction that human creativity was a gift from God that should be used to glorify the Creator and uplift the human spirit. But it was during the Renaissance that Christian influence on art reached its greatest flowering. This wasn't despite Christianity, but because of it. The Renaissance emerged as Christian scholars rediscovered ancient Greek and Roman texts, preserved in monastery libraries. Christian humanists argued that since humans were made in God's image, the human form and human experience were worthy subjects for artistic exploration. Leonardo da Vinci, perhaps the greatest artistic genius in human history, was deeply influenced by Christian themes and imagery. His Last Supper captures the pivotal moment when Jesus announced his coming betrayal, rendering human emotion and divine drama with unprecedented skill. His countless sketches of biblical scenes reveal an artist whose imagination was fired by the Christian story. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling remains one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. This wasn't secular art that happened to use religious themes. It was Christian art in the deepest sense, created by an artist who saw his work as an act of worship. Every figure, every gesture, every detail was crafted to communicate profound theological truths about the relationship between God and humanity. Raphael's Madonnas transformed the way people visualize the relationship between the divine and human. His gentle, loving portrayals of Mary and the Christ child spoke to something deep in the human heart. These weren't just pretty pictures. They were visual theology that helped ordinary people understand the radical Christian claim that God himself had become human. The artistic revolution extended far beyond painting and sculpture. Christian composers created entirely new forms of musical expression. Gregorian chant developed as a way to make prayer itself beautiful. Polyphony emerged as composers sought to create harmonies that reflected the harmony between heaven and earth. The great liturgical compositions of the Middle Ages and Renaissance turned worship into transcendent artistic experience. During the 13th and 14th centuries, churches became massive patrons of artistic creation, commissioning and purchasing enormous quantities of work from Christian painters and sculptors. Since many members of the public couldn't read during this time, art served as a visual scripture, helping people envision the stories of faith. Churches hoped these artistic creations would inspire deeper devotion and create stronger connections between believers and their faith. Christian artists during the early Renaissance began adding touches of realism to their work, making biblical figures look more true to life. They hoped to draw viewers into the artwork, helping them empathize with the subjects by recognizing themselves in the faces and settings of the paintings. As church leaders stressed the humanity of Jesus and how congregations should model their lives after his example, artwork began depicting a Christ who showed human frailties and suffering alongside divinity. This artistic transformation wasn't limited to Europe. As Christianity spread around the world, it carried with it this conviction that beauty and creativity were gifts to be shared with all people. Indigenous artists in Africa, Asia, and the Americas began incorporating Christian themes into their traditional art forms, creating magnificent syntheses of faith and culture that enriched the global artistic heritage. Chapter 7. The Liberation of Half of Humanity. As we drift deeper into our exploration of how Jesus Christ changed the world, we encounter perhaps his most revolutionary impact on human civilization: the complete transformation of how society viewed and treated women. In the ancient world into which Jesus was born, women were considered property at best, burdens at worst. Their lives were shaped by brutal realities that modern minds can barely comprehend. Roman fathers routinely abandoned baby girls to die of exposure because daughters were seen as economic drains on the family. Women had no legal rights, couldn't speak in public forums, and were viewed essentially as possessions of their husbands or fathers. Greek philosophy taught that women were inferior beings, naturally suited only for domestic servitude. Even Jewish culture, despite its many admirable qualities, relegated women to secondary status in religious and social life. Into this harsh landscape stepped Jesus of Nazareth, and everything changed. His treatment of women was so radical, so contrary to the established norms of his time, that it shocked both his followers and his critics. Jesus spoke with women as equals. He taught them alongside men. He counted women among his closest friends and most trusted disciples. He defended them against accusers and elevated them to positions of honor in his movement. Consider the revolutionary nature of Jesus' actions. He spoke publicly with a Samaritan woman at a well, breaking multiple social taboos in a single conversation. He allowed a woman of questionable reputation to anoint his feet with expensive perfume, defending her actions against his disciples' criticism. He appeared first to women after his resurrection, making them the initial witnesses to the most important event in Christian history. In a culture where women's testimony wasn't even accepted in courts of law, Jesus chose women to be the first evangelists of his gospel. This wasn't merely progressive thinking for its time. It was revolutionary behavior that threatened the very foundations of ancient society. Jesus' female followers weren't passive recipients of his teaching. They were active participants in his ministry, traveling with him, supporting his work financially, and playing crucial roles in the early Christian community. The transformation this created rippled through history with breathtaking speed. The early Christian church was so saturated with women that critics often dismissed it as a women's religion. Women served as deacons, teachers, and leaders in Christian communities. They hosted churches in their homes, funded missionary activities, and played central roles in spreading the Christian message throughout the Roman Empire. As Christianity spread and gained influence, its revolutionary view of women began reshaping entire civilizations. Christian communities stopped the practice of infanticide that had claimed countless female lives. They created institutions to care for abandoned children, particularly girls who had been left to die. They established new legal frameworks that protected women's rights and dignity. The change wasn't immediate or complete. Human societies changed slowly, and many Christians failed to fully embrace the radical implications of Jesus' teachings about women. But the seeds had been planted, and they continued to grow through the centuries. Medieval Christianity produced remarkable women leaders like Hildegard of Bingen, who composed music, wrote theology, and advised popes and emperors. The Renaissance saw women like Catherine of Siena influencing the highest levels of church and state. In more recent centuries, Christian movements led the fight for women's education, property rights, and political participation. Christian women established schools and colleges for girls when secular society saw no value in educating females. They founded orphanages and hospitals, created social reform movements, and fought against injustices like slavery and poverty. The modern women's rights movement, whatever its current form, stands on foundations laid by Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. The basic premise that women deserve equal dignity, respect, and opportunity traces directly back to the carpenter from Nazareth who treated women as beloved children of God rather than property to be owned. Today, in parts of the world most influenced by Christian civilization, women enjoy freedoms and opportunities that would have been unimaginable in the ancient world. Women serve as political leaders, business executives, scientists, artists, and professionals in every field. They can own property, vote in elections, pursue education, and make decisions about their own lives. This dramatic transformation didn't happen by accident or through the natural evolution of human society. It required a fundamental shift in how humanity understood the worth and dignity of women. That shift began with Jesus Christ, who looked at the women of his time and saw not inferior beings or economic burdens, but beloved daughters of the Most High God, worthy of love, respect, and honor. Chapter 8. The Foundation of Human Rights. As our journey through history continues in the gentle embrace of evening, we arrive at one of the most profound ways Jesus Christ transformed human civilization. The very concept of universal human rights, which we take for granted today, emerged directly from the revolutionary teachings of a first-century Jewish carpenter. Before Jesus, the idea that all human beings possessed inherent dignity and worth was virtually unknown in the ancient world. The civilizations that dominated the Mediterranean basin operated on principles that would horrify us today: might made right. The strong devoured the weak without consequence. Slavery was considered natural and necessary. Different classes of people were believed to have different levels of inherent worth. The notion that a slave deserved the same basic rights as a citizen, or that a barbarian possessed the same human dignity as a Roman senator, was not just foreign, but laughable to ancient minds. Greek philosophy, for all its intellectual sophistication, taught that some people were naturally suited for slavery, while others were born to rule. Aristotle himself argued that certain human beings were living tools, created by nature to serve their superiors. Roman law reflected these assumptions, creating elaborate hierarchies that determined a person's value based on their birth, wealth, and social position. Into this stratified world came Jesus with a message so radical that it would ultimately overturn the entire social order. He proclaimed that every human being was created in the image of God, not just the wealthy and powerful, not just the educated and refined, not just those of the right ethnicity or social class. Everyone, the slave and the master, the Roman and the barbarian, the man and the woman, the adult and the child. All bore the divine image and therefore possessed infinite worth. This wasn't merely a nice religious sentiment. It was a revolutionary declaration that challenged every assumption about human society. If all people truly were created in God's image, then slavery was an abomination. If every person possessed inherent dignity, then political systems that treated people as property were illegitimate. If human worth came from God rather than from social position, then the entire ancient world order was built on a lie. The early Christians took these ideas seriously, and the results were transformative. Christian communities began practicing a radical equality that shocked their pagan neighbors. Slaves and masters worshipped together as brothers and sisters. Wealthy believers shared their possessions with the poor. Social barriers that had seemed permanent for centuries began to crumble in the face of this new understanding of human worth. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, it carried with it this revolutionary concept of universal human dignity. The change wasn't immediate or complete. Human societies resist transformation, and many Christians failed to fully embrace the radical implications of their beliefs. But the seeds had been planted, and they would eventually grow into the modern human rights framework that protects people around the world today. The development of legal systems based on Christian principles marked a crucial step in this transformation. The concept that law should protect the weak from the strong, rather than simply serving the interests of the powerful, emerged from Christian teachings about justice and mercy. The idea that all people should be equal before the law reflected the Christian belief that all humans possessed equal dignity in God's sight. Consider the remarkable transformation that took place in how society viewed children. In the ancient world, children were often seen as burdens to be endured, rather than blessings to be cherished. Infanticide was common, particularly for girls or children with disabilities. Parents had absolute authority over their offspring, including the right to sell them into slavery or even kill them. Jesus challenged all of this with his famous declaration that the kingdom of heaven belonged to such as children. He held up children as examples of the faith and trust that all people should have. He blessed them, taught them, and made clear that they possessed the same human dignity as adults. This revolutionary view of childhood would eventually transform how societies treated their youngest members. The abolition of slavery represents one of the most dramatic examples of how Christian principles transformed human civilization. While it's true that some Christians participated in slavery, particularly in the Americas, it was also Christians who led the movements to abolish this ancient institution. William Wilberforce, the British parliamentarian who devoted his life to ending the slave trade, was motivated by his deep Christian convictions. He and other Christian abolitionists argued that slavery was incompatible with the biblical teaching that all humans were created in God's image. The same Christian principles that challenged slavery also inspired movements for workers' rights, women's suffrage, civil rights, and countless other causes aimed at protecting human dignity. Lord Shaftesbury's campaigns to improve working conditions in 19th century Britain sprang from his Christian beliefs about the worth of every human being. The American civil rights movement was led primarily by Christian ministers who argued that racial segregation violated biblical principles of human equality. Today, when we speak of human rights as universal and inalienable, we're using language that emerged directly from Christian teachings about human dignity. The United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, while secular in its language, rests on philosophical foundations laid by Jesus Christ. The idea that certain rights belong to all people simply by virtue of their humanity reflects the Christian understanding that all humans bear the image of their Creator. This transformation continues to unfold in our own time. Wherever Christian influence spreads, it tends to bring with it greater respect for human dignity, more protection for the vulnerable, and stronger commitments to justice and equality. The process isn't always smooth or immediate, but the pattern is clear throughout history. Societies touched by Christian principles developed stronger protections for human rights and greater respect for the inherent worth of every person. The carpenter from Nazareth, who proclaimed that even the least among us possessed infinite worth, had unleashed a revolution in human consciousness that continues to reshape our world today. Every time we defend the rights of the oppressed, every time we insist that justice should be blind to social status, every time we assert that all people deserve equal treatment under law, we're participating in the ongoing transformation that began 2,000 years ago in ancient Palestine. Chapter 9. The healing response to human suffering. As we settle deeper into our evening exploration, we encounter one of the most remarkable patterns in human history. Whenever devastating plagues, natural disasters, or widespread suffering have struck human communities, those inspired by the teachings of Jesus Christ have consistently responded with extraordinary courage and compassion. This pattern has repeated itself so often across the centuries that it represents one of the most documented and transformative influences of Christianity on human civilization. The story begins in the earliest days of the Christian movement, when devastating plagues swept through the Roman Empire during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These epidemics killed millions and brought entire regions to the brink of collapse. The Roman response was predictable and pragmatic. The wealthy fled to their country estates. Government officials abandoned the cities. Pagan priests closed their temples and disappeared. Those who could afford to escape did so, leaving the poor and vulnerable to suffer and die alone. But something extraordinary happened in the Christian communities scattered throughout the empire. Instead of fleeing, Christians remained in the plague-stricken cities. They cared for the sick, buried the dead, and provided food and water to those too weak to care for themselves. They didn't limit their compassion to fellow believers. They helped anyone who needed assistance, regardless of their faith or social status. This Christian response wasn't motivated by medical knowledge or government policy. These early believers were responding to the clear teachings of Jesus, who had commanded his followers to care for the sick and love their neighbors as themselves. They understood that their faith called them to serve others, especially during times of greatest need, even at the risk of their own lives. The results were remarkable and well documented by contemporary historians. In cities where Christians provided basic nursing care, survival rates increased dramatically. Simply providing water to the dehydrated, food to the starving, and basic comfort to the suffering made the difference between life and death for countless people. Christian communities actually grew larger during these plagues, while pagan populations declined, not because Christians were immune to disease, but because their commitment to caring for others saved lives. This pattern of Christian response to suffering became established early and has continued throughout history. When bubonic plague devastated Europe during the medieval period, Christian monasteries became centers of medical care and research. Monks and nuns risked their lives to care for plague victims when others fled in terror. They developed new treatments, maintained detailed records of symptoms and remedies, and created networks of care that spanned the continent. During the cholera epidemics of the 19th century, Christian missionaries and medical workers were often the only people willing to enter infected areas and provide care. They established hospitals, trained local healthcare workers, and developed public health measures that saved countless lives. Their motivation wasn't professional duty or government mandate, but the Christian conviction that caring for the suffering was a sacred responsibility. The same pattern emerged during the Great Influenza pandemic of 1918, which killed millions worldwide. Christian hospitals, charitable organizations, and individual believers provided care when government resources were overwhelmed. They organized soup kitchens, established temporary hospitals, and cared for orphaned children whose parents had died in the pandemic. More recently, during the AIDS epidemic that began in the 1980s, Christian organizations were among the first to provide care and support for victims of this devastating disease. Despite initial fear and misunderstanding, many Christian communities chose to respond with compassion rather than judgment, establishing hospices, support groups, and medical facilities dedicated to caring for AIDS patients. The response to natural disasters follows the same pattern. When earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, or other catastrophes strike, Christian relief organizations are typically among the first to arrive and the last to leave. Organizations like Samaritan's Purse, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, and thousands of smaller Christian charities mobilize resources and volunteers to provide immediate relief and long-term recovery assistance. This consistent pattern of Christian response to human suffering has had profound effects on the development of modern humanitarian aid and disaster relief. The very concept that people have a moral obligation to help strangers in distant places who are suffering from disasters or diseases emerged largely from Christian teachings about universal human dignity and the commandment to love one's neighbor. The modern Red Cross movement, while officially secular, was founded by Christians who were motivated by their faith to create international standards for humanitarian assistance. The Geneva Conventions, which established rules for the treatment of civilians and prisoners during wartime, emerged from Christian concepts of mercy and human dignity. Today's vast network of international humanitarian organizations, emergency response systems, and disaster relief protocols all trace their roots back to the pattern established by early Christians who chose to stay and care for plague victims when others fled. The conviction that all human life has value, that suffering should be alleviated wherever possible, and that people have obligations to help strangers in need reflects the continuing influence of Jesus Christ on human civilization. This transformation of how humanity responds to suffering represents one of the most practical and life-saving ways that Christianity has changed our world. Every time emergency responders rush toward danger instead of away from it, every time medical workers risk their lives to treat infectious diseases, every time volunteers travel to disaster zones to help strangers, they're participating in a pattern of sacrificial service that began with a carpenter from Nazareth who taught his followers to love others as themselves. Chapter 10. The Democratic Revolution. As our gentle journey through history continues, we arrive at one of the most surprising ways Jesus Christ transformed human civilization: the development of democratic government and the rule of law. Today, we often take for granted the idea that political power should serve the people rather than the rulers, that laws should apply equally to all citizens, and that governments should protect the rights of individuals. Yet these concepts, which seem like common sense to modern minds, were virtually unknown in the ancient world and emerged directly from Christian teachings about human dignity and divine authority. Before Christianity, political power was typically understood in very different terms. Rulers claimed divine authority for themselves, declaring that they were gods or the chosen representatives of gods. The pharaohs of Egypt, the Caesars of Rome, and the kings of Mesopotamia all based their authority on claims of personal divinity or special divine favor. Their subjects were expected to obey without question, not because the rulers served the people's interests, but because the rulers themselves were considered divine. Jesus challenged this entire framework with teachings that would eventually revolutionize political thought. When asked about paying taxes to Caesar, he made the famous distinction between what belongs to Caesar and what belongs to God. This seemingly simple statement contained explosive implications. It suggested that political authority was limited, that rulers were not themselves divine, and that there were realms of human life that lay beyond the reach of government power. The early Christians took these ideas seriously, developing a theology of government that would gradually transform Western civilization. They taught that political authority came from God, but was delegated to human rulers for specific purposes. Governments existed to maintain order, protect the innocent, and punish wrongdoing. But they had no authority to demand absolute obedience or to interfere with people's relationship with God. This Christian understanding of limited government authority created space for individual conscience and personal responsibility that hadn't existed in previous political systems. If rulers weren't divine themselves, then people could legitimately question their decisions and resist unjust commands. If government authority was limited and delegated, then rulers were accountable for how they exercised power. The influence of these Christian ideas on the development of Western political thought cannot be overstated. The Magna Carta, signed in England in 1215, established the revolutionary principle that even kings were subject to the rule of law. This document, which became the foundation for constitutional government throughout the English-speaking world, emerged directly from Christian concepts of limited political authority and divine justice. The American Declaration of Independence and Constitution reflect these same Christian principles in their assertion that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights. The founders weren't all Orthodox Christians, but they were operating within a political tradition shaped by centuries of Christian thought about government, law, and human dignity. The concept of separation of powers, which prevents any single person or institution from accumulating too much political authority, emerged from Christian concerns about human sinfulness and the corrupting effects of power. If all humans were fallen and prone to selfishness, then political systems needed to include checks and balances that prevented the concentration of power in any single person or institution. The development of representative government also reflects Christian influences on political thought. The idea that rulers should be chosen by the people and should serve the people's interests rather than their own emerged from Christian teachings about human equality and the servant leadership that Jesus modeled. If all people possessed inherent dignity as children of God, then political authority should serve all people rather than just the wealthy and powerful. The establishment of independent judicial systems based on written law rather than the arbitrary will of rulers represents another crucial Christian contribution to political development. The biblical emphasis on justice, mercy, and impartial judgment provided the foundation for legal systems that sought to treat all people fairly regardless of their social status. The protection of individual rights, particularly freedom of conscience and religion, emerged directly from Christian experiences of persecution and their theological understanding of personal responsibility before God. Early Christians had learned through bitter experience what happened when governments claimed total authority over human life. Their insistence on religious freedom eventually expanded into broader protections for individual liberty and personal autonomy. The gradual abolition of slavery in Christian nations reflects the political implications of Christian teachings about human dignity. While the process was slow and often incomplete, the basic Christian principle that all humans were created in God's image eventually proved incompatible with the institution of slavery. Political systems influenced by Christianity gradually developed legal frameworks that recognized the fundamental equality of all people. The development of social welfare systems and government responsibility for protecting the vulnerable also traces back to Christian teachings about caring for the poor and disadvantaged. The idea that political communities have obligations to help their weakest members, rather than simply leaving them to suffer or die, emerged from Christian concepts of social responsibility and human dignity. Today, the democratic institutions and legal protections that people around the world struggle to establish and maintain all reflect the influence of Christian ideas about government, law, and human rights. The conviction that political power should be limited, accountable, and directed towards serving the common good, rather than the interests of rulers, traces directly back to the teachings of Jesus Christ about authority, service, and human worth. The carpenter from Nazareth, who taught that the greatest among his followers should be the servant of all, had planted seeds that would eventually grow into political systems based on consent of the governed, rather than divine right of kings. Every time people vote in free elections, every time citizens hold their leaders accountable, every time courts protect individual rights against government overreach, they're participating in a political revolution that began 2,000 years ago in ancient Palestine. If you enjoy Chapter 11. The Transformation of Economic Life. As we continue our peaceful journey through the corridors of history, we discover how Jesus Christ revolutionized not just politics and culture, but the very foundations of economic life itself. In the ancient world, commerce was brutal and unforgiving. The wealthy exploited the poor without conscience. Workers were treated as disposable tools. Economic relationships were built on power and exploitation rather than fairness and mutual benefit. Jesus introduced radical new concepts that would eventually transform how human societies organize their economic activities. His teachings about justice, compassion, and the inherent worth of every person challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which ancient economic systems were built. When he spoke of caring for the least among us, of treating others as we would want to be treated, and of the dangers of greed and exploitation, he wasn't just offering moral guidance. He was articulating principles that would eventually reshape civilization's approach to work, wealth, and economic relationships. The early Christian communities put these teachings into practice in remarkable ways. They shared their possessions with those in need, cared for widows and orphans, and created support networks that ensured no one went hungry or homeless. These weren't just acts of charity. They represented a completely different way of organizing economic life, one based on mutual care and shared responsibility, rather than individual accumulation and competitive advantage. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, these economic principles began to influence broader society. Christian merchants developed reputations for honesty and fair dealing. Christian employers treated their workers with greater dignity and respect. Christian communities created institutions to care for the poor and vulnerable that had never existed in pagan societies. The medieval guild system that dominated European commerce for centuries reflected Christian influences on economic organization. These associations of craftsmen and merchants weren't just business organizations. They were communities bound together by shared Christian values that emphasized quality workmanship, fair prices, and mutual support. Guild members took care of each other's families during times of illness or hardship. They established standards for business conduct that prioritized integrity over profit maximization. The development of banking and credit systems also shows Christian influence on economic life. While early church leaders were sometimes suspicious of lending at interest, Christian thinkers eventually developed sophisticated theories about just prices, fair interest rates, and legitimate profit that helped create the foundation for modern financial systems. The famous Medici banks that financed the Renaissance were operated by devout Catholics who sought to balance profit-making with Christian principles of justice and social responsibility. The Protestant work ethic that emerged during the Reformation had profound effects on economic development. Protestant reformers taught that honest work was a form of worship and that economic success could be a sign of divine blessing. This transformed attitudes toward commerce and industry, encouraging innovation, hard work, and careful stewardship of resources. The economic dynamism that characterized Protestant regions of Europe and later America reflected these religious influences on economic behavior. Christian missions around the world consistently brought with them not just religious teaching, but also new economic practices and technologies. Missionaries introduced improved agricultural techniques, established schools that taught practical skills, and created market systems that allowed local populations to improve their living standards. They fought against exploitative labor practices and worked to establish fair trading relationships between indigenous peoples and colonial powers. The abolition of slavery represented one of the most dramatic examples of Christian principles transforming economic relationships. While slavery had been central to ancient economic systems and remained profitable for those who practiced it, Christian abolitionists argued that treating human beings as property violated fundamental biblical principles about human dignity. The economic disruption caused by ending slavery was enormous, but Christian reformers insisted that moral considerations should take precedence over economic convenience. The development of labor unions and workers' rights movements also reflected Christian influences on economic thought. Many of the early labor organizers were motivated by Christian teachings about justice and the dignity of work. They argued that workers deserved fair wages, safe working conditions, and the right to organize because they were children of God, worthy of respect and proper treatment. Christian social teaching in the 19th and 20th centuries continued to develop sophisticated approaches to economic justice. Papal encyclicals, like Rerum Novarum, addressed the proper relationship between capital and labor, arguing for systems that respected both private property rights and workers' dignity. Protestant social gospel movements worked to apply Christian principles to industrial society's economic problems. The modern cooperative movement, which has created millions of worker-owned businesses around the world, traces its roots to Christian communities that practiced economic sharing and mutual support. Credit unions, which provide banking services to people often excluded from traditional financial institutions, emerged from Christian organizations seeking to help the poor build economic stability. Today's emphasis on corporate social responsibility and ethical business practices reflects the continuing influence of Christian teachings on economic life. The idea that businesses should consider their impact on workers, communities, and the environment, rather than focusing solely on profit maximization, represents a direct application of Christian principles to modern economic challenges. Microfinance institutions that provide small loans to help poor people start businesses often operate according to principles that reflect Christian teachings about helping the disadvantaged and creating opportunities for human flourishing. Fair trade organizations that seek to ensure producers in developing countries receive just compensation for their work are applying Christian concepts of economic justice to global commerce. The transformation of economic life represents one of the most practical and far-reaching ways that Jesus Christ changed human civilization. Every time employers treat workers with dignity, every time businesses prioritize ethical practices over maximum profit, every time societies create safety nets to protect the vulnerable, they're participating in an ongoing economic revolution that began with a carpenter who taught that love of neighbor should guide all human relationships, including economic ones. Chapter 12. The Revolution in Education and Literacy. As evening deepens and our exploration continues, we encounter another profound way Jesus Christ transformed human civilization through the democratization of knowledge and learning. In the ancient world, education was the jealously guarded privilege of the elite. Knowledge was power, and those who possessed it used it to maintain their dominance over the masses. The vast majority of people lived and died without ever learning to read or write, trapped in ignorance that served the interests of their social superiors. Christianity shattered this educational monopoly with revolutionary force. The religion that emerged from the teachings of Jesus was fundamentally a religion of the book. Christians believed that God had revealed himself through written scriptures that contained essential truths about salvation and proper living. But if these scriptures were truly meant for all people, then all people needed to be able to read them. This simple logic unleashed an educational revolution that transformed human civilization. Early Christian communities established schools not just for the wealthy few, but for ordinary believers who needed to read the Bible and understand Christian teaching. They translated scriptures into local languages rather than keeping them in scholarly Latin or Greek. They created alphabets for languages that had never been written down before. They sent missionaries to remote regions who combined evangelism with literacy training. The results were extraordinary. Wherever Christianity spread, literacy rates increased dramatically. Societies that had been entirely oral for centuries suddenly developed written traditions. Languages that had never been recorded were transformed into literary vehicles, capable of preserving and transmitting complex ideas across generations. The monastic movement that emerged in the early centuries of Christianity created the world's first systematic approach to preserving and copying written knowledge. While barbarian invasions destroyed libraries and scattered scholars across Europe, Christian monasteries became islands of learning where monks painstakingly copied ancient texts by hand. They preserved not just Christian writings, but also the works of Greek and Roman philosophers, scientists, and historians that might otherwise have been lost forever. These monastic libraries became the foundation for the university system that would emerge in medieval Europe. When the first universities were established in places like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, they drew their initial collections of books and their basic educational methods from Christian monasteries. The curriculum that developed in these institutions reflected Christian beliefs about the unity of all knowledge and the importance of studying creation in order to understand the Creator. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century accelerated this Christian educational revolution. The first major book printed by Gutenberg was the Bible, and the early printing industry was dominated by Christian texts. Suddenly, books that had been available only to wealthy elites became affordable for ordinary people. The Protestant Reformation that followed was largely driven by this explosion in literacy and access to religious texts. Protestant reformers like Martin Luther insisted that every Christian needed to be able to read the Bible for themselves rather than relying on church authorities to interpret it for them. This created powerful incentives for establishing schools and promoting literacy throughout Protestant regions of Europe. Countries like Germany and Scotland developed some of the world's first systems of public education precisely because Protestant theology demanded that all believers be literate. The same pattern repeated itself wherever Protestant missionaries traveled around the world. They established schools alongside churches, translated the Bible into local languages, and taught people to read not just for religious purposes, but as a basic human right. The global spread of literacy in the 19th and 20th centuries was largely driven by Christian educational efforts. Catholic educational institutions made equally important contributions to global learning. The Jesuit order, in particular, became renowned for establishing excellent schools and universities around the world. Their educational methods, which emphasized both academic rigor and moral formation, influenced educational systems far beyond Catholic communities. Christian educators also pioneered new approaches to teaching that reflected their beliefs about human dignity and potential. They developed methods for educating children with disabilities who had previously been written off as unteachable. They created schools for girls in societies where female education was considered unnecessary or even dangerous. They established institutions of higher learning for racial minorities who had been excluded from existing universities. The Sunday school movement that emerged in the 18th century England represents another crucial Christian contribution to mass education. These schools, which initially operated on Sundays because that was the only day working-class children weren't in factories, taught basic literacy and numeracy skills alongside religious instruction. They reached millions of children who otherwise would have received no formal education whatsoever. Christian educators also led the development of special educational institutions that served specific populations. Schools for the blind, the deaf, and those with other disabilities were typically established by Christians who believed that all human beings, regardless of their physical limitations, possess souls worthy of education and development. The modern concept of universal public education emerged directly from Christian beliefs about human dignity and the importance of knowledge. The idea that societies should provide free education to all children, regardless of their family's wealth or social status, reflected Christian teachings about equality and opportunity. Christian influence on education extended beyond basic literacy to include higher learning and scientific research. Many of the world's most prestigious universities began as Christian institutions and continue to reflect Christian values in their approach to learning and discovery. The conviction that truth was unified and that studying the natural world was a form of worship provided powerful motivation for scholarly investigation and scientific research. Today's global emphasis on education as a basic human right, on literacy campaigns in developing countries, and on educational institutions that serve disadvantaged populations all reflect the continuing influence of Christian ideas about knowledge and learning. the belief that every human being deserves access to education, that knowledge should serve human flourishing rather than just elite interests, and that learning is a lifelong responsibility, traces directly back to the educational revolution launched by followers of a carpenter from Nazareth who taught that truth would set people free. Chapter 13. The Transformation of Childhood. As our gentle exploration continues through the peaceful hours of evening, we arrive at one of the most tender and transformative ways Jesus Christ changed human civilization: his complete revolution in how societies viewed and treated children. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, we must first glimpse the harsh realities that define childhood in the ancient world. Realities so brutal that modern minds can barely comprehend them. In ancient Rome, Greece, and throughout the pagan world, children were considered the absolute property of their fathers, who held the power of life and death over them. Roman law granted fathers the right to kill their children for any reason or no reason at all. Newborn babies, especially girls, were routinely left on hillsides to die of exposure if their parents decided they were unwanted. Children with disabilities were almost always abandoned to die, as they were seen as burdens with no potential value to society. Those children who survived infancy faced lives of harsh labor and minimal protection. They could be sold into slavery at their parents' discretion. They had no legal rights, no voice in their own fate, and no expectation of care or protection from the broader community. Child labor was universal, and children as young as 5 or 6 worked in dangerous conditions that would horrify modern observers. Sexual exploitation of children was commonplace and legally protected. Roman and Greek societies considered relationships between adult men and young boys not just acceptable, but educational and beneficial. Children had no protection from physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. Their suffering was considered irrelevant to the functioning of civilized society. Into this dark world came Jesus Christ, with teachings that would revolutionize humanity's understanding of childhood. When his disciples tried to turn children away from him, Jesus rebuked them with words that shocked ancient sensibilities. "Let the little children come to me," he declared, "and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." In a single moment, he elevated children from worthless property to examples of faith and trust that adults should emulate. Jesus didn't just speak kindly about children. He fundamentally redefined their value and status in human society. He held children up as models of the humility and trust that should characterize all believers. He blessed them, taught them, and made clear that they possessed the same human dignity as adults. He warned in the strongest possible terms against harming children, declaring that anyone who caused a child to stumble would be better off with a millstone tied around their neck and thrown into the sea. This revolutionary view of childhood spread through the early Christian communities with transformative power. Christian families stopped practicing infanticide, instead caring for children whom pagan society would have abandoned to die. They rescued abandoned babies, particularly girls, and raised them as beloved daughters. They created orphanages to care for children who had no families, establishing the first systematic approach to child welfare in human history. As Christianity spread throughout the Roman Empire, it carried with it this new understanding of children's worth and rights. Christian communities developed elaborate systems for caring for orphaned and abandoned children. They established legal frameworks that protected children from abuse and exploitation. They created educational institutions that served children from all social classes, not just the wealthy elite. The transformation was gradual, but inexorable. Societies influenced by Christian teaching began to see children as gifts from God rather than burdens to be endured. Childhood came to be understood as a distinct and valuable stage of human development, that deserve protection and nurturing rather than exploitation and neglect. Medieval Christian communities continued to develop this new approach to childhood. Monasteries established schools that provided education and care for children from poor families. The Church created legal protections for orphans and developed systems of guardianship that prevented their exploitation. Christian theologians wrote extensively about the proper care and education of children, emphasizing their potential for good and their need for guidance and protection. The Renaissance and Reformation periods saw further development of Christian approaches to childhood. Protestant reformers emphasized the importance of educating all children, not just those from wealthy families, so they could read the Bible and understand their faith. They established schools and promoted literacy as essential for proper Christian development. Catholic orders created elaborate educational systems that served children throughout Europe and eventually around the world. The Jesuits, in particular, developed educational methods that recognized children's intellectual potential and emotional needs. Their schools became models for child-centered education that influenced pedagogical theory for centuries. The Industrial Revolution initially created new forms of child exploitation as factories sought cheap labor and families struggled with poverty. But it was Christian reformers who led the fight against child labor and for protective legislation. Lord Shaftesbury and other evangelical Christians campaigned tirelessly for laws limiting children's working hours and ensuring their access to education. Christian missionaries around the world consistently fought against practices that harmed children. They opposed child marriage, child slavery, and ritual child sacrifice wherever they encountered these practices. They established schools, orphanages, and hospitals specifically designed to serve children's needs. The modern concept of children's rights emerged directly from this Christian transformation of childhood. The idea that children deserve special protection, that their welfare should be a primary concern of society, and that they possess inherent dignity regardless of their family's social or economic status reflects centuries of Christian influence on how humanity understands childhood. Today's elaborate systems of child protection, public education, and pediatric healthcare all trace their roots back to the revolutionary moment when Jesus Christ declared that the kingdom of heaven belonged to little children. Every child safety law, every school system, every pediatric hospital, every organization dedicated to protecting children from abuse and exploitation represents the continuing influence of that first-century carpenter who saw infinite worth in the smallest and most vulnerable members of human society. The transformation of childhood represents one of the most profound and enduring ways that Jesus Christ changed human civilization, creating a world where children are treasured rather than discarded, protected rather than exploited, and nurtured rather than neglected. If you enjoy my stories, please support me by commenting, liking, and subscribing to my channel. I appreciate every single one of your comments, and I'm so glad to help you ease into your sleep. Good night and sweet dreams to all my viewers. Good night and sweet dreams to all my viewers. Chapter 14. The Gentle Revolution in Criminal Justice. As we settle deeper into the quiet comfort of evening, our journey through history reveals another profound transformation that Jesus Christ brought to human civilization. The complete reimagining of how societies respond to crime and wrongdoing. In the ancient world, justice was swift, brutal, and focused entirely on revenge rather than restoration. Criminal punishment was designed to inflict maximum suffering as a deterrent to others, with little regard for the humanity of those who had transgressed. Roman justice operated on principles of retribution and public spectacle. Criminals were crucified, thrown to wild animals, or forced to fight to the death in gladiatorial contests. The goal wasn't rehabilitation or even proportional punishment, but the demonstration of absolute power and the entertainment of the masses. Torture was routinely used to extract confessions, and the concept of mercy was seen as weakness rather than virtue. Throughout the ancient world, legal systems reflected the harsh realities of societies built on power and domination. The strong dispensed justice to the weak without concern for fairness or proportionality. Crime was met with overwhelming force, and the idea that criminals might be reformed or reintegrated into society was virtually unknown. Jesus introduced revolutionary concepts that would gradually transform humanity's approach to criminal justice. His teachings about forgiveness, mercy, and redemption challenged every assumption upon which ancient legal systems were built. When he spoke of loving one's enemies, of forgiving those who had wronged you, and of the possibility of transformation and renewal, he wasn't offering abstract philosophical principles. He was articulating a completely new understanding of justice that would eventually reshape civilization's response to wrongdoing. The famous encounter between Jesus and the woman caught in adultery illustrates this transformation perfectly. According to Jewish law, she should have been stoned to death. The crowd had already gathered, stones in hand, ready to carry out the prescribed punishment. Yet Jesus challenged them with words that cut to the heart of human nature. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." One by one, the accusers departed, leaving Jesus alone with the condemned woman. His response was revolutionary. Neither condemnation nor punishment, but mercy combined with a call to transformation. Go and sin no more. This incident captured the essence of the Christian approach to wrongdoing that would gradually influence legal systems throughout the Western world. Justice should be tempered with mercy. Punishment should serve the goal of restoration rather than mere retribution. Even the worst criminals retain their human dignity and possess the potential for redemption and change. Early Christian communities put these principles into practice in remarkable ways. They visited prisoners, provided food and comfort to those awaiting execution, and worked to reform legal systems that treated criminals as less than human. They established the first systematic prison ministries, believing that even those who had committed serious crimes deserved spiritual care and the opportunity for repentance. As Christianity gained influence throughout the Roman Empire, these new approaches to criminal justice began to reshape legal practice. Christian emperors like Constantine introduced reforms that limited the use of torture, protected prisoners from abuse, and created opportunities for clemency and pardon. The concept of sanctuary, where criminals could seek refuge in churches and receive protection from immediate punishment, emerged from Christian beliefs about mercy and the possibility of redemption. Medieval Christian societies continued to develop these transformative approaches to criminal justice. Canon law, the legal system of the Church, emphasized rehabilitation and restoration rather than purely punitive measures. Church courts offered alternatives to the harsh secular justice of the time, often focusing on penance and spiritual renewal rather than physical punishment. The development of the modern prison system reflects Christian influences on criminal justice reform. Rather than simply warehousing criminals or subjecting them to brutal punishment, Christian reformers envisioned institutions that could actually transform wrongdoers into productive citizens. The very word penitentiary comes from the Christian concept of penance, the idea that criminals should have the opportunity to reflect on their wrongdoing and seek genuine repentance. Quaker reformers in Pennsylvania pioneered many of the principles that guide modern corrections. They believed that solitary confinement combined with Bible study and reflection could lead to genuine spiritual transformation. While their specific methods may seem harsh by contemporary standards, their underlying philosophy that criminals could be reformed rather than simply punished represented a revolutionary departure from traditional approaches to wrongdoing. Christian influence on criminal justice extended beyond prison reform to include the development of probation, parole, and alternative sentencing options. The idea that some criminals could be supervised in the community rather than incarcerated reflected Christian beliefs about the possibility of redemption and the value of maintaining family and community connections during the process of rehabilitation. The abolition of capital punishment in many Christian nations represents another profound transformation in criminal justice philosophy. While debates about the death penalty continue, the growing movement toward life imprisonment rather than execution reflects Christian teachings about the sanctity of human life and the possibility of repentance, even for the worst criminals. Modern restorative justice programs, which bring together criminals and their victims to facilitate healing and reconciliation, draw directly from Christian principles of forgiveness and restoration. These programs recognize that crime damages relationships and communities, not just abstract legal principles, and seek to repair that damage through dialogue, accountability, and genuine remorse. The development of juvenile justice systems that treat young offenders differently from adult criminals emerged from Christian understanding of childhood development and the greater potential for rehabilitation among the young. Rather than simply punishing children who committed crimes, Christian reformers created institutions focused on education, moral instruction, and preparation for productive adult life. Today's emphasis on rehabilitation, mental health treatment, and addressing the root causes of criminal behavior all reflect the continuing influence of Christian principles on criminal justice. The idea that society should seek to transform criminals rather than simply punish them, that victims deserve healing as well as justice, and that even the worst wrongdoers retain their basic human dignity, traces directly back to the teachings of Jesus Christ about mercy, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. The transformation of criminal justice represents one of the most humane and hopeful ways that Christianity has influenced human civilization, creating systems that seek to heal rather than harm, to restore rather than destroy, and to redeem rather than discard those who have fallen short of society's expectations. Chapter 15. The Seeds of Global Transformation. As our peaceful journey through the corridors of time draws toward its gentle close, we find ourselves contemplating the extraordinary ripple effects that continue to emanate from the life of a humble carpenter who lived 2,000 years ago in an obscure corner of the Roman Empire. The transformation we have witnessed touches every aspect of human civilization, yet it represents only the beginning of an ongoing revolution that continues to unfold in our own time. Consider for a moment the world that existed before Jesus Christ walked among us. It was a civilization built on the assumption that human worth was determined by birth, wealth, and power. Women were property, children were disposable. The weak existed to serve the strong. Knowledge belonged to the elite. Suffering was accepted as the natural order. Justice meant revenge. Mercy was weakness. Into this harsh landscape came a teacher whose message was so radical, so contrary to accepted wisdom, that it seemed impossible it could ever take root and flourish. Yet flourish it did, not through force of arms or political manipulation, but through the quiet power of transformed hearts and renewed minds. One person at a time, one community at a time, one generation at a time, the principles taught by Jesus began to reshape human society in ways that continue to astound historians and sociologists. The hospitals where we seek healing when illness strikes trace their origins to Christians who believed that caring for the sick was a sacred duty. The universities where knowledge is pursued and transmitted emerged from Christian convictions that all truth was worth discovering and that education should serve all people, not just the wealthy few. The legal systems that protect our rights and freedoms developed from Christian teachings about human dignity and limited government authority. The art that adorns our museums and enriches our spirits flows from Christian artists who saw beauty as a reflection of divine creativity. The scientific methods that have unlocked the secrets of the natural world were developed by Christian thinkers who believed that studying creation was a form of worship. The democratic institutions that give people voice in their own governance emerge from Christian principles of equality and human worth. The protection of children, the advancement of women, the care of the elderly and disabled, the response to natural disasters, the fight against slavery and oppression, the development of international law, the establishment of human rights, the transformation of economic relationships, the reformation of criminal justice. All of these civilizational advances can be traced back to the revolutionary teachings of Jesus Christ about love, mercy, justice, and human dignity. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this transformation is how it continues to unfold in our contemporary world. Despite predictions that Christianity would fade as human societies became more sophisticated and secular, the influence of Christian principles continues to spread to new cultures and contexts. The values that Jesus taught, compassion for the suffering, care for the vulnerable, respect for human dignity, commitment to justice and truth, remain as relevant today as they were 2 millennia ago. In developing nations around the world, Christian organizations continue to establish hospitals, schools, and social service agencies that serve the poorest and most marginalized populations. Christian principles of human rights and democratic governance inspire movements for freedom and justice in societies struggling against oppression. Christian concepts of environmental stewardship motivate efforts to protect the natural world for future generations. The global response to humanitarian crises still follows patterns established by early Christians who chose to care for plague victims when others fled. International relief organizations, medical missions, disaster response teams, and refugee assistance programs all reflect the continuing influence of Jesus' command to love one's neighbor as oneself. Even in societies that have become largely secular, the moral foundations laid by centuries of Christian influence continue to shape expectations about human behavior and social responsibility. The assumption that governments should serve their people rather than exploit them, that the strong should protect the weak rather than prey upon them, that knowledge should be shared rather than hoarded, that justice should be merciful rather than merely punitive. These ideas seem natural to us now, but they represent revolutionary departures from the way human societies functioned for most of history. The carpenter from Nazareth, who never traveled more than 200 miles from his birthplace, who never wrote a book, who never commanded an army, who never held political office, who was executed as a criminal by the authorities of his time, somehow managed to set in motion forces that continue to transform human civilization. His influence reaches into every corner of our daily lives, from the hospitals where we are born to the schools where we learn, from the laws that protect us to the art that inspires us, from the scientific discoveries that improve our lives to the charitable organizations that care for those in need. This transformation didn't happen overnight, nor was it accomplished without struggle and setbacks. Human societies resist change, and many who claim to follow Jesus failed to fully embrace the radical implications of his teachings. Yet the seeds he planted continued to grow, often in unexpected places and through unlikely agents, gradually reshaping civilization according to principles of love rather than power, service rather than domination, mercy rather than revenge. As we conclude our gentle exploration of this remarkable story, we are left with a profound sense of wonder at the power of truth and love to transform even the most entrenched systems of oppression and injustice. The revolution that began in ancient Palestine continues today, carried forward by countless individuals who have encountered the same transformative power that changed the world 2,000 years ago. If you enjoy my stories, please support me by commenting, liking, and subscribing to my channel. I appreciate every single one of your comments, and I'm so glad to help you ease into your sleep. Good night and sweet dreams to all my viewers. Good night and sweet dreams.